Those of you who don't know me, I'm Gerald Chinen, and I was here at the very beginning of Wellspring with Pastor Dale, and it's always good to be back with the Wellspring family, so thank you, and I want to thank the pastors of the church who are always so open and to share the pulpit like this, and it's really wonderful that other voices get to share from here and that you get to hear other perspectives, so thanks to Rebecca and all the other pastors. So I really appreciated listening to all the not all, but most of the speakers in this series that we're doing based on this book, Backyard Pilgrim. And if you haven't picked up a book, I think you can still do that. And it's a wonderful, wonderful little devotional booklet. And where we are now in this booklet is the last third, and it's based on what's called the Passion of Christ, which is the week that led Jesus into his crucifixion. Today, I want to share with you on the topic of when it's difficult to forgive, when it's difficult to forgive. And as Keith was sharing that story of Big John, I was thinking to myself, he must have some stories about his own journey about forgiving people who have hurt him in his life. I just thought about that and wondered it might be interesting to hear some of his stories about his journey toward forgiveness. Let me begin by asking you, have you ever had one of those weeks when nothing seemed to go right? Maybe even just this past week, maybe you've had that. So I had one of those weeks. I've had several of those weeks, but I remember clearly one of those weeks when I was still living in California. It started when my car was broken into, and the only leather jacket that I had ever owned or will ever own was stolen. Now that's on me because it was kind of stupid of me to leave my leather jacket on the backseat of my car. You know, for someone who stole that jacket, the temptation was too great, so they took it. And then a couple of days later, I got an email from my bank asking me if I'd made these purchases, and they listed it on the email. And of course, I hadn't. And it was pretty significant amount. But fortunately, they were able to replenish my account. But I had to get a new debit card. And if you've been in that situation, you know it takes a while to get your new debit card. I realized this is a first world problem, but it was still inconvenient. I didn't like that. I didn't like that feeling. And then finally, at the end of that same week, one of the tires of my car just blew out. And I happened to be with a friend of mine. We had just had lunch. Fortunately, I was close enough to my apartment that I was able to drive into the carport and change my tire. Actually, I called AAA. They changed my tire. Yeah. But you know, that week in my life was nothing compared to some of the lives of other people in the world. And definitely that week in my life was nothing compared to the Passion Week of Christ, the week leading to his death on the cross. It began when he came into Jerusalem and the crowd was yelling, Hosanna, Hosanna, Hosanna in the highest. And much of the same crowd later on in the week were yelling, crucify him, crucify him, crucify him. That same week, a disciple of his, a trusted disciple who was in care of the treasury, Judas, betrayed him to the authorities. And Jesus spent an agonizing evening in what we know was called the Garden of Gethsemane, revealing his humanity as he prayed to God in heaven, asking if God would let this cup pass, if there was another way instead of death. That same evening, Jesus was arrested and taken away. Initially, his disciples tried to stand up for him. And you might remember that Peter took a sword and he took a swipe at one of the Roman soldiers and cut off his ear. But after that, his disciples went into hiding. And then one evening, Peter was standing with a crowd of people, and some people recognized him, but he denied that he knew Jesus. Not just once, but we know he did it 3 times. And get this, Jesus faced 2 very unfair trials. very unfair trials. First, before the Jewish ruling council, what is known as the Sanhedrin. And then he was brought to the Roman governor Pilate. Now, as Jesus stood trial for blasphemy before the Sanhedrin, they brought in witnesses, all kinds of witnesses who bore false witness about Jesus, false claims about Jesus. Being found guilty of blasphemy meant that he could be stoned to death. But instead, the Sanhedrin took him to the Roman governor, where then he was tried for treason and insurrection, which meant it was punishable by, as we know now, crucifixion. Now, neither one, stoning or crucifixion, is a very humane way of punishment. But the powers that be had no compunction to show Jesus any mercy or any kindness or any compassion. And finally, as Jesus hung dying on the cross, we read this from the Gospel of Matthew. Those who passed by or derided or hurled insults, shaking their heads and saying, "You who would destroy the temple and build it in 3 days, save yourself. If you are the Son of God, come down from the cross." He trusts in God. Let God deliver him now if he wants to, for he said, "I am God's Son." Now, I will confess to you, and please don't tell anybody else about this. I trust you. I spend way too much of my idle time watching videos on Facebook. Anybody do that? Or TikTok? No, not too many of you. Okay. And the videos that I tend to gravitate to are ones done by a fellow by the name of Dar Man. You hear this name, Dar Man? Okay. Don't look him up because you're going to get hooked. But most of his videos happen to be about bullies. And at the end of each video, either the bully gets his or her comeuppance, or they have an epiphany of some kind, and they realize they shouldn't be bullying other people. Now, I don't know about you, but I get a certain kind of satisfaction when bullies get put in their place. Don't you? Yeah? It's an amazing thing to me that Jesus had the power to rain down all kinds of comeuppance upon his mockers and his bullies. And in fact, in the Garden of Gethsemane, while he was being taken away by the Roman soldiers, he tells his disciples, "Do you think that I cannot appeal to my Father, and he will at once send me more than 12 legions of angels?" He had all kinds of power. And yet, instead of seeking reprisal, Jesus, as he did so often in his life, displayed tremendous restraint. Something most of us have a hard time doing. We find these powerful words about one of the kindest, most merciful things that Jesus offered from the Gospel of Luke, which is our main text this morning. When they came to the place that is called the Skull, they crucified Jesus there with the criminals, one on his right and one on his left. Then Jesus said, "Father, forgive them, for they do not know what they are doing." And they cast lots to divide his clothing. Instead of calling on God in heaven to rain down retribution, instead, Jesus asked God to forgive all of his tormentors, to forgive all of his mockers, to forgive all of his bullies. And even while he's asking God to forgive, there are soldiers at the foot of the cross gambling for his clothing. The final sign of Jesus' humiliation. But Jesus is also asking that God in heaven forgive the soldiers at the foot of the cross. Now, here's something very fascinating about Jesus' words of forgiveness at the cross, something that I had not noticed before. But I was doing some reading about this passage, and I came across this commentator who wrote this. Jesus, in fact, doesn't forgive his captors. He doesn't forgive his executioners. He doesn't forgive his killers. Stay with me now. he can't, it seems. So instead, he asks God to forgive them. That Jesus can even manage to ask God to forgive them is stunning in its compassion and understanding. But that Jesus cannot manage to forgive them on his own is just as stunning, as it reveals the conflicted beauty of Jesus' humanity and his divine calling to love. Now, this is not a very conventional statement. It's not a statement that we would expect, right? And yet it's thought-provoking and it's stimulating because it reveals something. We sometimes forget about the dual nature of Jesus, but especially about Jesus' humanity. On the cross, even as he is in pain and dying, he knows that his calling is to love and to forgive even those who are responsible for his suffering and for his pain. It was in Jesus' heart to forgive. But the human side of him found it difficult to offer forgiveness on his own, much like how we find it humanly difficult to forgive sometimes. Jesus understands that to forgive is the godly thing to do, the godly thing to do. Jesus understands that to forgive is the right thing to do. It was, in fact, why he was called into this world, to offer grace and forgiveness and love. But in those difficult moments on the cross, he could only find the strength to ask God in heaven to forgive on his behalf. It was as though Jesus was beginning the process of forgiveness by reaching out to God in heaven. Friends, even then, Jesus was revealing to us all that while forgiveness is important for us to offer, God understands that there are some terrible offenses and abuses that are done to us that sometimes it is impossible to offer forgiveness on our own and to offer it freely. You know, there may be lots of reasons not to forgive, to withhold forgiveness. For one, the wrong, as I mentioned, done to us may be so horrific that to forgive the person who offended us, who hurt us, might seem to be condoning their actions. Perhaps we don't forgive because we don't want to be vulnerable to be hurt again by that same person. Sometimes not forgiving gives us a sense of rightness or a sense of righteousness that gives us power over the person who hurt us. And to forgive them means that we're giving up the power, and we don't want to do that. Even Jonah of the Old Testament, you remember the story of Jonah? He found it hard to extend grace to the people of Nineveh. He refused to go to Nineveh, you remember. You might recall he refused actually to go to Nineveh because he just could not see it in his mind's eye or his heart or his spirit that the people of Nineveh should deserve grace and deserve another chance. And that is us. Jonah is like us, and he represents us in so many ways because we often feel like other people don't deserve grace, because grace is what we offer when we forgive. Perhaps asking God to forgive then might just be the beginning of the process of forgiveness for us. Maybe I don't have the strength or the wherewithal to forgive right now, but I can entrust to God what I hope to do for myself someday. This may sound strange in a way, but I think that willingness in our spirit to at least go to God and ask God to forgive in our stead reveals a sliver of light in our hearts that we know that to forgive is the godly thing to do. If you're finding it hard to forgive someone who's caused you pain, let me tell you, don't beat yourself up because you join a whole group of people who find it difficult too. Because even the most seasoned and the most mature people of faith have had times in their lives when they just could not bring themselves to forgive. You see, we human beings, we can be really complicated. Have you noticed that? Sometimes we can be very complicated. And so everything that we do, oftentimes it's not very straightforward, and obviously it's never perfect. In fact, the Apostle Paul himself knew this firsthand when he wrote in Romans, I do not understand my own actions, for I do not do what I want, but I do the very thing I hate. I love the way the Jesus book, the Pidgin English Bible, I love the way it's translated. It says, I don't know what I stay doing, because, hey, I don't do things I like do. I do things that I don't like. I realize my Pidgin isn't so good. Because I've been away on the mainland for a long time, so. But whatever language or dialect, I think God understands when we struggle to forgive, to do the right thing and to forgive. I think God really understands, because God understands our humanity. Asking God to forgive, even when you find it difficult to do, is then a baby step. It's a small step. Perhaps asking God to forgive is all the strength that you have right now. From the Luke passage I read earlier, in Jesus' own words, Jesus says, Father, forgive them, for they do not know what they're doing. I really appreciate those words, because it gives me another insight when I'm having a hard time forgiving someone. Jesus' words of incredible grace. He knows that none of his tormentors there standing nearby the cross understand the significance of his suffering. None of them understand the significance of his life on the earth. He isn't excusing them by asking God to forgive, but he's recognizing how little they know about his life and why he was here. Now, I have found that to be true in life in general, that the people who hurt us may not even know that they've hurt us. And I think the opposite is also true. We don't even know the people that we have hurt. I want to tell you a true story. So for many, 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 many years, I had been holding on to great pain in my life. It was seething anger in me, actually. Every time I thought of this particular person in my life who had hurt me, I have many, many pages in journals that I keep detailing how much resentment and anger that I had held toward this person. I was convinced that this person knew how much that they had hurt me and that he didn't really care. At the same time, I missed our friendship. He had actually tried reaching out to me several times, but I never responded. I felt righteous in my pain and my indignation. So I couldn't give in to any overtures of friendship. But one day, as I was journaling about this, I asked myself in the journal, how much longer are you going to hold on to your anger and your resentment? Something had to change, something had to give, and it became obvious to me. It was on me. It was on me to do something different. So, with all the strength I could muster, I called him. And of course, he was very surprised to hear my voice because, as I mentioned earlier, we hadn't been in touch with each other for years. And so we arranged to have lunch together. When I found it appropriate, I brought it up to him. But I believe that God prepared me, unbeknownst to me, that God prepared me, because what I said initially was, can you forgive me? And then I detailed for him what he had done to hurt me and why I was holding on to so much anger and so much resentment. And get this, he was surprised. He was surprised. He had no idea that I was feeling this way, and he had no recollection of any of what had occurred. He had no clue, no idea. And in that moment, I had an aha moment. It's like what Pastor Rebecca said last week. I was like one of those disciples. I felt like a doofus in that moment. All these many years, I was in pain and feeling so angry, and my friend was living the good life, unaware of his part in my suffering. But he apologized immediately, and I want to say in a very humble and a very gracious manner, for they do not know what they are doing. When you're having a really difficult time forgiving someone, remember that that other person may not even know the part in your pain. When that is the case, you may be the only one suffering. Dr. Lewis Smedes, who taught theology and ethics at the seminary that many of your pastors went to and many of the members of your church went to, wrote a book many years. He actually wrote this really wonderful book a few years ago called The Art of Forgiving. And he suggests several things that we can do when we're hurting and having a hard time forgiving other people. First, he says, think. Think. Come to as much clarity as possible on what actually took place, what actually happened between you and that person who hurt you. It may take some time, he says, to get a clear picture of what actually happened, so you've got to dwell and think about it. Number two, he says, evaluate. Was it an accident or a misunderstanding? Or did the other person know what they were doing? Did that person merely annoy you? Or did they truly wrong you? 3, talk. Consult with a friend or a counselor, and I might add a pastor. Don't try to carry the burden of your pain alone. Number 4, feel. Take time to be alone with yourself without your computer, which is really, really hard to do these days, or your iPhone or your laptop. Spend some time in quiet reflection to put a name on what it is that you're feeling. Can you name what it is that you're feeling? And then number 5, he says, pray. And I want to read for you what he says about praying. Forgiving is a tough act to perform when bad things are done to us. Here is a chance to be honest with God. Tell God how much it hurts, how full of hate you are. Admit you need help. Ask for it and use it when it comes. Peter, Jesus' disciple, asked Jesus once, Lord, if another member of the church sins against me, how often should I forgive? As many as 7 times? Religious leaders at the time taught that it was only required 3 times for one person to forgive another. So Peter was being magnanimous by saying at least 7 times, but he gets the surprising answer when Jesus says, not 7 times, but I tell you, 77 times. Ouch, ouch. Jesus recognizes how difficult we find forgiving others at times. So forgiving is actually a practice that we do over and over again. Let me close with this one last reflection. That friend I told you about, with whom I had a hard time forgiving. So this is what happened leading me into that meeting that we had. These are some of the events that happened beforehand. In my journal, in the early years, I would write my prayers. And I remember in my journals, my prayers about this person, I'd write down, God, I don't have it in me to forgive John. That's not his real name. Okay? But I don't have it in me to forgive John. Eventually, I began to write and pray, God, I'm asking you to forgive him. I'm just asking you to forgive him. And I wrote and I prayed that for years upon years. But gradually that prayer became more like, God, help me forgive John. Help me forgive John. And then about a year before we actually met, I began to pray and write, I forgive John. Now, Mind you, I didn't feel it. I didn't feel it in my gut, but I felt like I needed to begin praying that. But it was a slow and gradual process of forgiving and letting go, and eventually it led to the real thing, eventually. And I close with this from theologian Diana Butler Bass, who writes, "Forgiveness is often a complex and lengthy process requiring reflection, self-care, and sometimes professional support rather than a single act of letting go." So I'd like to encourage you to take some time this week to look over the reflection questions that you have in your bulletin and your program. And I want to say, may God help you begin that process today if there is someone that you really need to forgive. I'd like to invite the worship team up and lead us in another song as we close.